Well, we have reached our appointed hour, and we will begin this webinar. And I want to first introduce myself, Joshua Landis. I am the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And today we have the honor of speaking with Fowzia Karimi. But before introducing her, I want to thank Daniel Simon, the Assistant Director and Editor-in-Chief of World Literature Today. He invited me to lead this discussion, which is part of World Literature Today's Newstat Festival. And Ms. Karimi is serving on the Newstat jury. I would also like to thank Marjan Sadafipur for helping to organize this seminar. So let me just alert the audience that we will have questions from the audience after about half an hour to 40 minutes of discussion with our speaker. And we have put this such that you'll be able to ask the questions yourself. It'd be helpful if you would write them into the Q&A section. If you see the Q&A section, you can click on that and put your questions in there. And I can ask you then to ask your question. And at in the last 30 minutes of this discussion, which is going to go on for an hour and 15 minutes till 15 after the next hour. And that way we can all join in a discussion together, because we're not a monstrous number of people. So we can exploit this rather intimate setting. So let me introduce our main highlight. Fowzia Karimi was born in Kabul, Afghanistan. She emigrated to the U.S. in 1980 with her father, her mother, and her 4 sisters. Her father worked for the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, but when the Soviet Union invaded the country in 1979, their friends began to disappear, and the country was no longer safe for them. Ms. Karimi has a background in studio art and biology. She received her MFA in creative writing from Mills College. Her work explores the correspondence between the written and the visual arts. Her illustrated debut novel, Above Us, the Milky Way, was published by Deep Vellum in April 2020, and she is a recipient of the Rana Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and has illustrated a number of books and lives in Denton, Texas. And without further ado, we might begin our discussion. And I would ask, Fowzia, if you would begin by reading 2 short sections that really are at the very beginning and will introduce us to what your writing's like. Airplane and Tidy Forces. Thank you for being with us, too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Landis. It's such a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I will start with these 2 readings. Just a brief description of the book itself. It is a collection of memories, of dreams, of fairy tales, and of dirges for the dead. It is about this family of 7 immigrating from Kabul to Southern California, although that's never mentioned in the book. They're nameless in the book. The countries are nameless, but it is very much my own story of my early childhood. I'm going to begin with these 2 short pieces. The first is about this family of 7 leaving Kabul, and the second is about what they leave behind. When they left, this is called Airplane. When they left the old land, the sisters kissed their grandmother's spotted hands and did not pull away their faces from her moist, uneven breath. They hugged their many aunts, kissing 3 times their warm cheeks. They bowed the crowns of their heads to their many uncles' hands and lips, nodding respectfully as the uncles listed the do's and do nots. And they spoke timidly and in whispers with the cousins they knew as intimately as they did each other, avoiding their eyes and their questions, secretly holding the same unanswerable questions in their own minds. The flight of the stairs to the mouth of the waiting airplane was steep, the metal cold, and the lofty view it afforded them indifferent to their many questions. Why, where, how long, and what for? The sisters looked down silently, yet intently, at the gathered tribe who stood 12 long and 3 deep, in heels and in coats, lipsticked and combed, smiling awkwardly with relief or with confusion, collectively willing back tears. When waving goodbye from the platform at the top of the stairs to the neatly assembled relatives standing down below, the sisters did not neglect their own reflected images, 5 small girls dressed in clothes and wearing expressions identical to their own. The Mirror sisters stood inside the terminal and looked back out onto the airstrip from behind 10-foot-high windows, not knowing to question, not understanding the airplane, the overpacked suitcases, the flowers in the departing sisters' arms. The sisters, leaving, waved and waved again from atop the stairs at the mouth of the airplane, blew kisses and shouted promises to the family who would remain and endure, shouted over the noise of the airplane's roaring engines, and waved again from the belly of the airplane, their small faces plastered 2 and 3 to a small window. But the sisters behind the glass within the terminal stood with arms immobile, chins tilted, and did not know what to make of the strained assembly on the tarmac. Excuse me.
Thank you. Now,
would you like me to read Tidy Forces or?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. So this next piece is Tidy Forces. How cleanly the visiting forces sever tongues at right angles, remove eyeballs whole, arrange extracted teeth and fingernails in order. How smartly the soldiers line the streets of the occupied city, rifles at their sides, standing tall in their smart matching uniforms with clear blue eyes, combed blonde hair, shining beneath polished helmets. How nimbly their colossal tanks maneuver through the narrow streets of the old city and effortlessly climb and descend its hills. And how smoothly the rich blood flows down those sloping streets. No neighborhood is too inaccessible, too remote for the humming vehicles of the visiting forces. No walls too high or doors too thick to dull the efficient knock of visitors who do not take no for an answer, irrespective of time of day or night. How neatly the visiting forces prepare the school children, the radio technicians, the hairdressers, the dentists, and the politicians. With great organization and proficiency, do they compel the people of the country to follow their program, to emulate their smart ways. And with such soft, quiet methods, do they dispose of those who will not. The capability with which they dig into the rocky soil of the arid land is wondrous. How tidily they cover the mass graves afterward. Not a limb protrudes, not a groan filters through. And those who insist, those who speak, are allowed to do so in orderly and suitable fashion. They are proficiently dismembered, packaged in compact boxes or sacks, and in a timely manner delivered home to their families, who hear them clearly upon arrival. How tidily the visiting forces prepare the country.
Boy. Now, you left Afghanistan when you were very young.
Mm-hmm.
And the book really bears that out in many ways, because your process of remembering things and putting together little recollections, it really follows this sort of childhood effort to make sense of what's going on. Could you why don't we read? Well, how did that shape the way you've really packaged this book, which is quite unique?
Yeah. So memory is really the bulk of the content of the book, but it also gives it its shape. I think from a really young age, it's just in my nature. I've always just observed and noted down. It was something that I just did naturally. But at the age of 6, when the Soviets came to occupy Kabul, that went into hyperdrive. This need to set down memory, to bear witness to everything that was going on around me. I think this is in part because as a child you don't have volition, you don't have autonomy, and at the age of 6, there wasn't a whole lot that I could do, and yet the need to help in some way, to fight in some way, even this catastrophic event. At first, it was an event. It was, like I read in this piece, the lining of the streets of Kabul with foreigners, with people who looked nothing like us, these Soviet soldiers. I remember that moment very distinctly of driving through in a cab with my mother and looking at these people who just really looked terrifying because they all have their guns on, over their shoulders, their rifles and their helmets and military clothing, which I'd seen before on television when, the president had on a holiday, for example, when they would show soldiers marching, but those were Afghan soldiers, and it was never something I really thought about. But to see these foreign soldiers come and to know that the night before the city had been bombed and that something had shifted, I really felt the need to collect this, as well as everything going on around me. There was a lot of whispering. The adults didn't want the children to know what was going on. They themselves didn't really know what was going on. But I would listen. I would stop and sometimes even hide, so I could gather what they were saying, because I felt this was important. This needed to be collected. And then we moved to the US and it continued. We weren't there seeing or hearing these things, but the stories came through, in one fashion or another. My parents, I would say bi-weekly, they went to a funeral. And these weren't funerals for people, for Afghans who had escaped to the United States. These were funerals for those who continued to die on a weekly basis. So I collected those memories. There were a few in particular from Afghanistan that I've always held very closely. And so I think when I started to write, I thought I was going to write about my family, nothing about the war, but it just sort of just took a life of its own on. And it really became a book about the losses and the dead in Afghanistan. And in terms of the form of the book, memory really dictates that too, because memory is not this continuous stream. It's these moments that rise up and sort of take over your head and perhaps your body too. I think memory is a very, it affects everything, not just your vision. You're not just visualizing something, but you can sense on many levels. So memory happens in these little pockets that rise and recede, and the book is like that. Some of the pieces are really short, some are much longer, because we tend to stay with certain memories and sort of travel through them, and that space expands. And then the photographs that are in there, they're all old family photographs. So again, memory. When I was little, we had this box of photos and a couple of albums, and I would say it's the biggest legacy we escaped with. We came with a few rugs, those were really important, some china, and then these photographs, which were so important because a lot of Afghans didn't come with those things. So they'd see our photographs and say, wow, you brought photographs. But I think at the time they were taken, they were just photographs of day-to-day things. But when you are in exile, these photographs from a time that's been buried otherwise underneath years of war, they really take on a significance. So those photographs, some of them are in the book.
Right. Now your book is full of joy and fun, particularly in the episodes with your sisters and family in the United States. But as you say, it is largely about loss and fighting against, I guess, the realities that are going on in Afghanistan. Could you read us one more passage, "The Dead," and which has to do with loss and in a sort of, in a sense, a memorial for all the people that you left behind? I suppose it's a bit of survivor's guilt to a certain extent. Maybe that's the wrong term to use, but that anxiety about all the people that you left behind.
Yeah, no, that is definitely an element, the survivor's guilt. So just one thing to say quickly about the book, it's made up of these few hundred episodic pieces based on memory, dreams, fairy tales. But what gives the book sort of its backbone, I would say, is the alphabet. The book is an abecedarium. And so I'm going to read the letter D. D, the dead. And there are many that will file through this book. They are loved ones, family, friends, and some are strangers. They are comfortable here, perhaps not uninvited. I was born into a culture whose first law is hospitality. I've observed this trait in members of my family near and distant. We all open the door, set out the tea, live with the dead. My father's family was modestly sized next to my mother's burgeoning clan of city dwellers. The suffering on both sides was tremendous, but in my father's small family of farmers, the losses seem remarkable. His family was cleaved and then cleaved again to an excessive degree and in brutal ways by the war. My aunt, my father's only sister, had 5 children and lost all 5 in one or another manner. My father lost all 3 of his brothers. It is strange, whether chance or fate, that his own life was not taken. In the beginning, when the forces first arrived, disappearances were common. My father would have been labeled as extremely dangerous to the new and occupying government he worked for. He worked, after all, for the embassy of their foremost enemy. And his friends, his co-workers, those he was acquainted with and those he cherished, were picked up one by one, imprisoned, tortured, murdered. The week after we left the country, my father's name was read off a list of enemy sympathizers. He was one of many who needed to be brought in silence. If they knew my father, they would have known he is silent by nature and would not harm the smallest of creatures. They would know he thinks of family and land, but little of politics. When they came to silence him, we were already gone. They missed us, but just. We did not leave intact. The knowledge of death, the wisdom you gain from the understanding that a beloved uncle is tortured, then buried alive, a cousin decapitated, that women are raped, have their fingernails pulled out, their breasts cut off. This wisdom you carry with you across borders and over the years of your life. This wisdom circles the nuclei within your cells and ensures you metabolize all suffering, great and small. And this wisdom reshapes the young in ways unknowable to those fully grown. This knowledge remakes the children into something else. Yes, it was strange to arrive in a peaceful land, to share a classroom in a schoolyard with children who still had their innocence and peered out through a single pair of eyes. Excuse me. For our lids opened and closed as theirs did, but revealed intermittently different sets of eyes. We could stand at once in a desolate cityscape surrounded by tanks and headstones and on a school playground filled with a din of laughter and bouncing balls, skipping children. I remember seeing my sisters across that schoolyard and seeing them apart, unnatural among the other children. And when in passing, we were close enough to catch each other's eyes, the cognition was both sweet and painful. We had come from a place no one knew existed, from a reality we could not explain to anyone, and we had seen and known things we dared not utter to those around us. They reshape and redefine you, the dead. They cast their pall over you, draw the pink from your cheek, or color it in your lips a too deep crimson, and they hold your hand while you skip, climb, and jump rope. They are loved ones, and there are others I don't recognize. The man who carries a book half torn, he comes and goes silently. But I do not know who he is, what it is he wishes to communicate, if anything. He isn't in a hurry and seems content to be dispossessed, unbound to land or time. He simply comes and goes over the days of my life, as do the other war dead, carrying the half of a book he never opens, but which seems an extension of himself, and the hand that clutches it, as if it is his blood that circulates up and down the spine of the book, in his thoughts that make its pages flutter. The dead are many and pass through and reside in books comfortably. Perhaps it is in books they find solace and home. They move through this one, and some may stop a moment to gaze up at you. Do not avert your eyes.
Boy. Now, let us turn to your artwork. I would love it if you would show us, if you would put up your screen and walk us through some of the marvelous artwork that really peppers the story and gives us a third dimension to this.
Of course.
Book.
So this is the cover, obviously. The book is a love letter to my family, to Afghanistan, to the dead, and to the cosmos. So on the cover, you have our planet, the Earth, and behind it, the sun, the moon at the bottom right, and the Milky Way wrapping around it. Here's the back. As I said, the book is made up of a few hundred episodic pieces. 26 of those pieces are alphabet pieces. Here's the letter C. And the book has both photographs from my childhood, but it also has original watercolor paintings that are based mostly on, both Eastern and Western medieval illuminated manuscripts. So here in letter C, this piece is all about color, about life before the war, how it was filled with color. In the photograph, you see my mother and my oldest sister on these poppy-covered hills that in the springtime, Afghans would go to these hills out in the countryside and picnic in the springtime. It was a big day of celebration. Here in the letter Q is a piece was based on how there isn't a whole lot to explain war. What is it? What does it do? I don't know. I think you can question it again and again. But as the writer, how little help I am. And the image is the whale of war, which comes up in areas in the book. And this mythical bird carrying the head of, actually in this case, my cousin's head. He was beheaded. And he screams out what war is, and we don't understand. We hear it, and yet, it's just a wail. It's the song of war. Here's the letter S with, I guess, a cosmonaut. This is a sort of self-portrait of just being something like an astronaut up above the earth, having great love for this planet and great love for what is above, and in trying to understand what war, what just suffering in general is on this planet. I think we tend often to look up to the sky for answers. This is a piece about my mother. This is a photograph of her from when she was a teenager. She was a great lover of Indian cinema. So she would go see these Hindi films in the city center. Her father, who is actually, my grandparents are Uzbeki and Tajik. They left Central Asia for Afghanistan because of war that arrived to their countries. So her father was, he was Muslim, but he wasn't very strict at all. So he would send his girls to the movie theater to go shopping, and they would go in their mini skirts and their beehived hair. And this is a piece about her watching Hindi movies. Here, I'm using the image actually over the text. It's a piece about immigration of not of the living immigrants like we were, but of the dead, who they don't stay in the places where they are violently killed. They cross borders, they travel. So they're traveling over the text here. This is very directly from biblical illuminated manuscripts. This is Hellmouth, a character you often see in those old Bibles. And usually in those Bibles, you have demons coming out, pulling in the sinful into the mouth of hell, down to its bowels. And in my book, Hellmouth represents the Soviet torture chamber where we lost people who were taken in and never came out. Those who did were very much changed after the experience. This is the dead, the many dead who. This particular image shows a dead boy who is wrapped in the traditional Islamic wrappings, but sainted here, because I felt strongly when I was writing this book that something had to be done for these people, innocent people who just lost their lives, and this need that I had to sort of sanctify and anoint them in some way. Not as saints or prophets or anything, but just of simple people who lost their lives senselessly. This is a photograph of my father on the right and two of his friends during his college years. The man in the middle was his best friend, and someone I remember very clearly, just a wonderful, wonderful human being who always brought us gifts as kids. And really, he was a part of the family. But he was an engineer, and on his way, along with 4 other engineers, to a school site. This is in the first year of the war in 1979. He and the other 4 were picked up, and they were hacked to pieces and left on the side of the road. And this is very sad. But the way that he was recognized was that his brother was a doctor in the city hospital. So when they brought these body parts back, someone came to his brother and said, there is a head that looks like you. So that's how he was identified. And this happened the day before he was meant to get married. This actually goes with the piece, The Dead, that I wrote and read just a few minutes ago. This is the image that goes with that piece. So my cousin who was beheaded, there's a piece about him in the book called The Suit. And he was actually killed by the religious police who, in the early years of the war, as a way to fight the Soviets, these different Mujahideen groups would come together, and they I think one of the ways they thought they could bring people together was around the religion. And so they went around telling people how to dress and, not to become Europeanized through the Soviets and the city people. This is actually an image of my father living when he was young in his village. But the piece about my cousin always reminded me of my dad. My dad was one of these people. He left his village at a really young age to go get an education. And that was very rare at the time. He actually ran away from home at the age of 15 to do that on his own. And his nephew, years later, I think, had similar inclinations. And one day he was walking down the village road, and these men of God told him that he was not allowed to wear a suit, that he needed to grow a beard. He did not listen. The next time they saw him, they cut off his head and threw it into his mother's courtyard. This is him. And this is his brother, who was a taxi driver in Kabul. The book really is, I would say he is at the heart of the book, and maybe the impetus for writing the book in the first place, though I'm not sure I knew about that when I started writing it. But he's very much at the heart of it. He's someone I remember very clearly. I thought of him as an uncle because he was so much older. He was in his early 20s, and he was picked up. He picked up a fare as a taxi driver, and it must have been an informant. There are many of those in that first year, 1979, and they picked him up, and he disappeared. We didn't know what happened to him. My parents and his wife went searching for him for days, and finally learned that he'd been imprisoned and as a political prisoner. There's no reason why someone like him had anything to do with politics. He was a cab driver. So he was picked up and taken in, and they tried for a long time to gain his release, and heard at one point that they were releasing prisoners from that prison, that you had to arrive early to pick up your person. So I remember this day very clearly. Again, I was 6, and I remember being at his house. We waited at his house while his wife and my parents left to go bring him home after he was released. They didn't know much. They just knew prisoners were going to be released. So I remember that day sitting on the floor in his house and life just moving about me, and thinking about one thing, about having him back, and being excited and yet really anxious. And the hours went by, and the morning turned to afternoon and to night, and it was dark. And after dark, my parents came home without him because they had not released him, but they had gotten a little bit of information from one of the other prisoners who were released, and they said he'd been tortured and then buried alive. So this painting is, again, a way to sanctify the dead. This is a tradition in early Islamic illuminated manuscripts where the saints and the prophet would have this veil over their faces, a white veil. I've given him a black veil, again, as a way to anoint the innocent war dead. I think you're on mute, Dr. Landis.
Well, boy, you went back to Afghanistan in 2015, and you were able to you were able to meet members of your family who are still there. Describe your trip back and what that evoked in you.
Yeah, I mean, it was an emotional trip on many levels. I hadn't been back since leaving at the age of 7. I left on my 7th birthday and went back 35 years later. And it was hard initially because the reason we went back, my mother had passed away the year before, and we went back on the first anniversary of her passing to see her sisters who were still living at the time, and to commemorate her passing with them in Afghanistan. And there was this brief window, or so we thought, where it was safe to travel back. And just weeks before we left, the airport in I believe it was in Kandahar, was taken over by the Taliban, and a lot of parts of the country were being taken over, including my dad's village, actually. So what happened in 2015 is very similar to what happened recently. The Taliban were making inroads and taking over large swaths of the country and coming towards Kabul. So before leaving the State Department, when I called them about, what can we do in terms of safety, they said, you shouldn't go. Absolutely not. This is not a good time to be traveling. They'd had a lot of intelligence saying that there was going to be worse to come in Kabul itself. But, we didn't know, was it completely going to shut down? Was this going to be the only chance to travel back? So we went, my father, my 2 younger sisters and I. And it was wonderful to see family, people, some whom I'd never met. They were born after we left, others that I remembered clearly from childhood. But it was just devastating. I mean, seeing these people who had lived, at that point, with 35 years of war. Some of them had escaped to Pakistan, some to India, some to Iran, but they'd all come back once the Taliban fell in 2001. So they'd been trying to make their lives, and for these 15 years, they'd done fairly well, considering they're not wealthy people, but they were getting by, and some of the young women were working for NGOs and getting degrees in college. The boys too. At the same time, there's just this dread, this constant dread, because while we were there were bombings, and there was a massive earthquake as well, which when it happened, we thought it was another bombing. And there's just this feeling, this constant feeling of anything could happen at any moment. a person can walk out the door and not come home. And, this is one of the more peaceful periods in Afghanistan's recent history. But it was just really, really sad to see it. That, again, comparing my life to theirs, how can you not? That guilt is there. I have this very peaceful life in the United States, and even though I always have the dead with me, to live through that is an entirely different thing. And I saw it in their faces and their bodies, their livelihoods. Food was scarce. Again, this is Kabul. I think it's much worse in the villages. And we didn't make it out to the villages. Kabul just got shut down during that period. There were roadblocks everywhere because of, again, the intelligence that there were going to be bombings. So to think now that it's even worse than it was in 2015 when I was there, and that these relatives are now, continue to be caught in the midst of it. Many of them have lost their jobs. One was actually a journalist, and he managed to leave the country just days before, thankfully. But everybody else is stuck there. And we have no idea what's going to happen from here on out.
No, we don't. And OU is trying to bring 10 Afghan scholars to the OU campus, and it's a very difficult process because many of them who fled the country can't get to American consulates, and the American consulate isn't processing papers for people outside the country. They're trying to deal with the big number of Afghans that they hurried out in those last days and took to refugee camps. And one of those just Shabnam Khaliliar, who is on her way, just arrived in New Jersey and is now being processed at Fort Dix. But we hope she'll be able to join us soon. But that brings us to this present episode. And I would, I'd be remiss if I didn't try to bring you up to give us some thoughts about, in a sense, our newspapers are filled with two different narratives. One is the terrible heartbreak of watching the Taliban overtake Kabul and the country, and everything that America worked for, and the elites that it attached itself to, and who attached themselves to the United States, like your father did, are going to be brought low by this. But on the other hand, there's the other story, which is perhaps this will bring some relief, particularly in the countryside where the fighting has been so intense, and the Taliban has been able to unite the country in a way, and perhaps there's some hope for some stability and the end of war, which we couldn't see the end of as long as America was there. How do you process this? As you watch this, how have the thoughts gone through your own mind as you've seen this whole, this newest regime change tear through Afghanistan?
I think, like everyone else, I've been devastated. When the Taliban took Kabul, those images that came out, it's just heartbreaking. I think I especially feel with the women and girls of the country who had made some advances, but I think those are all lost now. Whatever the Taliban promises, we can't really rely on their words. We've seen that before. It's a really complicated situation. I think it's why it took the United States 20 years to try to do something about it, and in the end not be able to. It's complicated because you have different groups in Afghanistan. You have those living in the cities and those living in the villages and the countryside. There are different types of people. There are the different ethnicities. There's Pakistan very much involved and has been all this time helping the Taliban. And then Iran on the other side, there's interest in the region. And then Europe, I think, wants to help in some way. I'm not sure what they can do. They're closer, though. And then and the efforts the United States has made, which it helped some. It helped those in the cities, but in the villages. The United States killed many, many innocent people with drone attacks. I've even heard stories about torture by the Americans. I don't know what to think of those. It's what the villagers themselves say. So, stories like this that don't get documented. There aren't journalists out there speaking to these people. And from what I hear, the villagers are happy to have the United States gone because they were living in this constant state of fear for those 20 years. They couldn't go anywhere. There are families who didn't see each other for a couple of decades because travel was so perilous, to get from one part of the country to another not that far away. So I've heard stories about families finally seeing each other now that the Americans are gone. And yet again, in the cities, people are being taken in, journalists are being tortured, killed, and those who helped the United States, many of them are still caught there. And these aren't, I would like to say that they're not necessarily the elites. These are very normal people who were lucky enough to get these jobs. And my father too, he wasn't one of the elite who managed to get away. He just very luckily happened to have a job at the US Embassy. And it was with the embassy's help, but also with my mother bribing officials to get documents stamped. It was just a series of things that happened that I really just seem more lucky than anything that we got out when so many couldn't. So yeah, most of these people who are stuck, they aren't those elites who got out with their private airplanes and had tons of money in Dubai and second homes. These aren't the ones who took all the money that the United States put into the country. I saw them with my own eyes when we were driving around Kabul in 2015. These people would drive around in these huge Hummers and hanging off all four corners of the car, because traffic's not very fast in Kabul, it's very congested, men with rifles on their shoulders, just really terrorizing the people around them. And these are the people with the money who worked in government. So there's the corruption, years and years of corruption of money taken by individuals for their own needs rather than sent out to the villages to build schools or to help, women advance in any way. There's just so many factors that go into it. It's a very complicated situation. As far as hope for the future, I mean, you have to have it, right? Even after these 40 years of seeing one terrible chapter after another, an endless war, and knowing of the suffering and pain of people in that country, you have no choice but to have hope for that part of the world. And my hope is that the Taliban will come through on some of these promises, but the economy is, in free fall. So will they actually manage to do it? They're very good at terrorizing and destruction. Are they any good at governance? Who knows?
Right. Well, thank you for that. Let's turn to our audience now, and we're going to allow people to speak themselves. And this is the first time I've done it, so it'll be a little bit of an experiment in how to allow people to the microphone. But we have allowed you to talk. If you would raise your hand, there's a raise hand thing. I think, allow you to talk. And okay, Alexander Jabari, who is my esteemed colleague, we ask you to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Persian literature. Yes, Alexander. Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you for sharing with us from your book and for your talk. In addition to the horrors of war and violence that you were speaking of, I was struck with, when you were giving us readings from the book and sharing images from the book, how there also seemed to be a kind of recurring theme of wonder and strangeness. I wondered, first of all, if you would agree that this was a theme in the work, and if so, how much of this was about how you've made sense of your own experience, how much of this was about how the reader should relate to the material. I kind of wanted to invite you to speak a little bit to that theme of wonder.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised you caught that in those pieces that I read, because there's some of the darker pieces, but there is a great deal of wonder and joy in the book, and that comes from my love for fairy tales. It comes from my love for the planet and for the stars. Really, I just in addition to carrying these stories with me my whole life, I've always been deeply, deeply inspired by the natural world around me, and just I find wonder everywhere, whether it's in literature or in the stars or in relationships. The sisters in the book, they share a lot of joy and wonder as children. I think often we think wonder is this thing that has to have its own place, and usually it's the place for children and stories for children. But wonder, it's, I mean, we all know it, and I think it's important to continue to go there as adults to find beauty in the world, because otherwise, what are we left with? And in this moment, especially in the United States, there's so much focus on the negative, that I think I don't know, we really lose something precious when we leave something like wonder behind, or we leave something like joy behind. So that there's a lot of that in the book, because I think it's important.
Indeed. Alexander, a follow-up?
Sure. It's just, it was especially in the images that I was getting this as you were talking about how you were drawing from the kind of manuscript tradition. And there is such a rich tradition of the, Ajaib Name, the Ajaib al Makhluqat, these kind of manuscript works that are all about evoking that sense of wonder. I love how you put it right now, because I think you're absolutely right, or I would agree with you that it also doesn't have to be something positive.
Mm-hmm.
We can react, I think, to the painful things in life, not only with grief, but with wonder at the kind of the possibilities that they engender. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you. I love your thoughts as well. I share them.
Thank you, Alexander. John Thompson has a question for you. John, would you like to ask that live? Let's see if I need to. Where have you gone, John? There you are, up there. Let me ask to unmute. Okay, you need to unmute yourself, John. Are you there?
Down here. Am I
Yeah,
unmuted?
You're good.
Oh, okay. Great. Thank you very much. Oklahoma City is there's going to be several hundred refugees from Afghanistan coming to the metro area. And the Oklahoma City Public Schools are going to get a lot of them. And I put a link to an article in the newspaper. Mary Mellon is a great leader. And I was just wondering if they should be hooking up with both of you and the OU Center here, and with field trips and whenever it's appropriate, and so they can get some guidance on their transition, and the school system and the other volunteers get guidance.
Well, John, let me jump in here and say that OU has been working. Our dean at the College of International Studies, Scott Fritzen, has been spearheading an effort to get in touch with Catholic Relief and the other state organizations which are helping the 1,800 refugees that are on their way to Oklahoma, to get them, language training for foreign. We have a big center for language training in our college for foreign students and so forth. And so we're trying to network and do as much as we possibly can to help the larger state effort. And I think there are a lot of new NGOs that are popping up to embrace this.
Yeah,
It's
and
very heartening.
I would love to help however I can.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Right. If there's, just raise your hand if you want to, ask a question, and then I'll be able to see you. Now, tell us. Let me ask you about your sisters, because much of your book is really the joy of being a family and exploring America and finding a new world here. And both your parents are so dynamic, and your mother in particular is clearly, not only did she figure out how to get you out of the country and to bribe this little scribe at the entranceway to the visa place, and she just understood that how to get the family ahead and put it together and keep it in one piece. And clearly, that family has been, the heart and soul of everything So tell us a little. What's happened to your sisters?
Well, we are all over the U.S. right now. Actually, we moved back to LA. So the three of them are in Southern California, still after having a couple of them having lived elsewhere in the United States. One is in Washington State, and I'm out here. My dad lived in Las Vegas for a number of years. After my mom passed, he moved back to California. So most of them are there in Southern California again. And it's, like, maybe it came through in the book. I hope it did, but I come from a family of very creative people. Not necessarily.
How are they able to rebuild their lives in America so quickly? I mean, so successfully.
Yeah, they didn't have much of a choice. I mean, you come here and you have to make it work. But I think my parents were just really special individuals, really hardworking. I mean, my dad grew up on a farm in Afghanistan, so from a very young age, he was up, before dawn, and then would fall asleep, after dinner, just exhausted from working the fields from a young age. And then, like I said, he ran away from home to get an education and put himself through school and got, he worked with the Germans for a little while, worked at the embassy. My mom in Afghanistan at the time, most women, you were free in a lot of ways, but most women didn't work outside the home. She was a parent, but we came here and she just bloomed and blossomed, got a job right away, didn't speak the language, went to night school. My dad spoke English, but they just started working, and they didn't have especially high-paying jobs. We lived on 2 minimum wage jobs, 5 kids. They just worked really hard, and also had these really big open hearts, so that the Afghan community, as it started to build in the LA area, it grew and grew, and they were very much a part of that. It was an interesting childhood because we had the American childhood. I'm very much a part of that. Television, books, all of that, and at the same time we had this other life. So it was 2 lives lived simultaneously, which was really wonderful and rich. The big parties we went to, sadly the many funerals that took place, weddings happen, all the things Afghans would do in Afghanistan, they continue to do here.
We've just got a nice question. Hushang Noor, would you answer live? Would you ask your question live? Oh, there you go.
Oh, hi, this is Hushang. Thank you for this conversation. Ms. Karimi and Dr. Landis, I appreciate it. I'm actually hanging onto my wheelchair and walking. As you know, I had a surgery and kind of listening and learning and hoping to pitch in a little bit. I teach English free of charge to Iranians and other Farsi speakers on my Instagram and Telegram page. And it's easily accessible to anybody who wants to learn English. So if any of the newcomers, refugees, regardless of what level of English they have, they can utilize that and begin learning this language. So just wanted to let the audience, as well as that I've been teaching for 4 years, and I teach in Farsi. So as long as they know a little bit of Farsi, the rest should be a piece of cake.
Thank you, Mr. Noor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. How did you decide to become an artist and not to go biology, become a doctor, or do something that most first-generation Americans do in order to get ahead in this capitalist world?
I don't think I can speak for all Afghans, but I think it generally holds true that Afghan Asians are a bit different than some of the other Asian immigrant communities that come here. Education is not primary, I should say. Because Afghans are so social, all having those attributes are much more important. So in my family, for example, it was much more important to be able to serve guests, to be able to speak. It reminds me of Jane Austen novels. There's just this really beautiful and many-layered quality and discussion that happens. So you're taught to do those things, which I was never very good at. I was very shy. My older sisters were much better at that. And I would get pulled away from homework all the time to come and cook or help out with something. So education, that was my own thing. I very much wanted it was more that I just have a real lust for learning. I'm very curious. I love many different things. And I had promised them that I would be a doctor. So they sort of, because I wanted to, they sort of looked to that as something hopeful in their future, and had this idea that I would become a doctor and go back to Afghanistan and help there. But around the age of 14, 15, I turned to the arts. It just happened, first with visual art. So I went to school to study, painting, but with stuff happening at the university I was at, a lot of the painting teachers were given early retirement. So I did photography and ceramics. And then I turned to biology, and not biology in order to go to medical school, but biology in order to study botany, field botany, which again, a lot of the programs around the country were shutting down their field botany departments. It was going more towards lab work and pharmaceuticals and stuff. So made another shift and turned to writing. But I would say all of it makes its way into my writing.
Now, in order to end up, I would love it if you would read us one more section from your book. I know we haven't pre-planned this, so you may not. Yeah. I'm going to give you a few seconds to find another passage.
Okay.
We'd love to hear one more.
Let me see if I can find. Let's see. I'm trying to find something that's a bit lighter so we can end on a lighter note.
There's a lot of joy in the book, and there's a constant feeling of that youthful sort of curiosity, as Professor Jabari was saying, of the joy of discovering things, and even in the saddest recollections when you're trying to process clearly these moments of intense loss. There is sort of a curiosity that and an innocence that pervades almost every one of these little vignettes.
Yeah, and I think that's partly because I wanted it seen through the eyes of a child. I mean, there are a lot of adult themes going on, but I think the two can live side by side.
Right.
So I'm going to read this piece called Conveyance, and I'll show you the image afterwards. Conveyance. The sister, always flitting, skipping, sprinting, caught a glimpse of the cat in the corner of her eye as she bounded diagonally across the yard, from the scorching patio, over the hissing sprinklers, to the back gate, up which she routinely liked to climb barefoot, and over which she liked to keep an eye on the goings-on in the alleyway the gate bordered. Having spotted the cat, she stopped before the gate, and rather than climbing it, leapt again over the sprinklers in a direction perpendicular to the fence, to slide into the cool, dry shade under father's grape arbor. The cat, unperturbed, lay in a corner, stretching out along the arbor's trellis. The sister sat cross-legged in front of it, so that the two met eye to eye. She looked over her shoulder and about her, across the expanse of lawn and toward the house. She and the cat were alone. The midday sun kept the others indoors. Mother's cooking on a Sunday drew them to her circle. The animated sister settled down and began to match her breath to the cat's idle, resonant purr, and tried to elongate her pupils to match the cat's vertical slits. The cat stared. The sister stared. The two respired in synchrony. The sun pushed its rays through the grape leaves onto the cat and the sister's fur and hair, warming them in patches. The sister and the cat gazed at one another. The sprinklers pattered softly across the lawn, rosebush, and patio in the distance. And then the girl fell, headfirst, into a slumber that was not a slumber, into a world that was mirror image to her own world in all but one way. Here, the cat spoke in the sister's first tongue. Yes, the cat. In this world, very plainly spoke in the sister's birth tongue. And the cat asked the sister, "Do you truly enjoy running through and leaping over the odious wet sprinklers?" To the cat, the sister looked happy enough, her wild hair swinging across her shoulders, her flushed face revealing teeth and tongue, which released the intermittent whoop and roar as she bounded here and there. Or, have your mother and sisters doled out the terrible punishment because you have misbehaved again? Have they discovered your collection of dead flies and beetles? The cat stared and waited for an answer. It was familiar with the family's ways, but didn't always comprehend them. The cat waited. The sister purred. And here's an image of...
There is it. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a comment by Lubna Mirza, who's going to answer, who's going to speak to us now.
Okay.
Lubna, you have to take yourself off mute. You have to unmute yourself, Lubna. I guess it's a little difficult. Are you able to do that, Lubna? Ask to unmute. There you go. Any rate, I just want to, I will fill in because she's written her comment here, and she says that I volunteer for a Shiite clinic in Oklahoma City, and I saw one man from Afghanistan who was there to ask for a work excuse because he had foot pain, and he came back and talked to me about his wife and 5 children, and said that she is unable to sleep. She would see the body parts and blood stuck on the walls as soon as she tried to close her eyes. There was a bomb blast in her neighborhood, and she could not escape from these images and memories. And Lubna commented how your talk about the dead, your chapter about the dead, really evoked this same kind of trauma of this Afghan that she spoke with.
Yeah, when I've spoken to Afghans about writing the book or thinking about it earlier on, the one comment I would get again and again is, we all have these stories, which I very much understand, having grown up around it. But there's so much of this, and it's I think like any war, genocide, anything atrocious like this that happens historically, there's so much that is lost that we never know about or hear about. And I think it's really important to get some of it out there. I really hope that there are more Afghan writers who begin to write about these things, talk about these things.
Well, on that note, let us bring this wonderful webinar to a close. And I want to thank you so much for being with us and really for introducing me to your book, which was such a joy. I began reading it and I couldn't stop. It was so full of creativity that the voice is so many perceptions that are clearly put in this childhood way, but they're so mature and make one constantly want to read more and more. It's not a sad book, even though it seems like a very sad book, and it is a requiem for all of these dead that you've enumerated, and of Afghanistan at large. But it's full of beauty, and it's so imaginative in every way, and that the lovely Milky Way, which in a sense represents all those souls that have been lost in Afghanistan. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank World Literature Today. I thank World Literature Today for allowing me to participate in this wonderful festival.
Thank you so much, Dr. Landis. It's been a privilege and an honor to be with you today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. All right, and thank you to our audience. Very nice of you to join us. Till next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.